It's 6:01, so I'm going to formally start here so that we can get underway. I have my screen share right now, and everybody will see our introductory slide here. But when we do the roundtable introductions, I'll stop screen sharing so that we get the Brady Bunch screen and people can see who's in the call today, because these really are framed as a discussion and not just like a presentation. So I'd like to formally welcome everybody here this evening for our second discussion series for the Kootenay Soil Building Network. Tonight's topic is nitrogen availability, and our guest expert tonight is Josh Andrews, the Nutrient Management Specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. You may recognize Josh's face because he was the one who was touring around the Kootenays this fall doing some soil sampling and soil health education. So thank you for joining us tonight, Jeff. The Kootenay Soil Building Network is being delivered by the Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisors, but it is through funding with the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food and their extension program. So we thank them for their support for this additional extension programming for our region. And Jeff Nemo, who you probably also recognize as well, he's like our co-project colleague on this project. So it's nice to like forge the bond between the Ministry of Agriculture and the farm advisors to deliver some soil education and extension through the Kootenays. Also, you'll see Sarah Hirschfield there. She's my colleague, co-worker with the Kootenay and Boundary Farm Advisors and also working on the Soil Building Network. And Jeff and I will be co-facilitating the discussion this evening, and we'll bring in Josh in about 10 minutes to kind of dive deeper into some of those topics. I also just want to respectfully acknowledge that I am on the traditional unceded territories of the Ktunaxa and Sinixt. And without further ado, we will get in there. Oh, sorry. Hard when your little face is over all the content you want to talk about. Our agenda this evening, we're going to do a roundtable introduction from everybody who's participating in the call tonight. Jeff and I will provide a very short context for nitrogen management in the Kootenays. Then we'll introduce Josh and get into our discussion and have some more thoughts on that. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so we can see our participants tonight. And the way we're going to do our roundtable introduction is I will call your name as I see it on the Brady Bunch screen. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you're farming. David Zernhelt.
Yes, cattle ranching, so forage production as well. I farm a little bit of wood, and we're in the Beaver Valley area of almost eastern BC, but just on the edge of the plateau, Caribou Plateau.
Okay, thanks for joining tonight. And Scott, hi, you made it tonight.
I remember. Scott from Bentplow Farm, organic veggie grower, just outside
Scott, you sound like a chipmunk.
Oh God.
This is Scott. He's from Bentplow Farm. He's going to figure out his audio so he can participate in the discussion. Try it again.
Give me a minute.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to you. Ange, go ahead.
Oh, I'm glad I was muted because I just snorted. Scott, that's awesome. I'm Angela Weir. Sorry, I got all distracted. From Crooked Horn Farm in Winlaw, and I grow mixed organic vegetables on about 2 acres.
Awesome, thanks, Ange. And Jordy Thibault.
Jordy Thibault, a cattle rancher, just a couple of minutes outside of Cranbrook, so basically convert forage to beef.
Awesome, thanks for joining tonight. And Karen Bowers.
Hi, I'm not far from Winlaw, actually, probably about 45 minutes north, just a bit north of New Denver. I'm a consultant and I'm doing articling agrologist at the BCIA.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for joining. And Lily up in Meadow Creek. Lily, did you hear me call your name there? I see your There's
Sorry, I
Lily.
couldn't find my mic. I'm Lily Shell from Meadow Creek, north end of Kootenay Lake, and I'm doing beef cattle, farming beef.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining. And as Anastasia and partner.
Aras and Anastasia, we are in north of Winda, Appledale, Perry siding area. And we just moved here a few months ago, kind of in transition, but hoping long-term to build a diversified orchard here.
Okay, thanks so much for joining. And Scott, do you want to test that there? You said
Yeah, I think I'm good now.
not as funny anymore, but
no. Yeah, so Scott from Ben Plow Farm, organic veggie grower just outside of Nelson, BC.
Thanks. And Rick Taggart.
Yeah, we're cow-calf, Radium Hot Springs, growing beef and forage.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Nice to see you. And Brad Braun.
Either works. Hummingbird Farm, we're on the Slocan River. We grow flowers.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. And Lavona.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lavona. I'm based in Thompson Nicola. I'm a colleague of both Josh and Jeff's, and happy to join in and learn a little bit about nitrogen and also about the discussions with the network. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. And Truce Zelionka. Maybe I don't see a face, so maybe they're on silent, which is totally fine. You don't have to introduce yourself. Nigel, are you there?
My name is Truce Salonka. I don't have a camera. I'm a retired commercial floriculturist out of Guelph University, and we've retired into Balfour area, and we are just starting to grow our own vegetables for our families and stuff.
Okay, thank you so much for joining. And no worries about your camera. Nigel, go ahead.
Hi, Nigel from Preston. Cartwheel Farm, we do organic mixed vegetables.
Great. And Nigel has serious questions for Josh tonight on measuring this nitrogen availability. We prepped him. Thanks for joining. Johnny Abs.
Hi, John Abenanti, Earthy Organics Farm in the Fruitvale area, and we farm vegetables, 2 acres.
Thanks for joining tonight, John.
You
and
betcha.
Kai Kosher.
Yeah, hello, Kai Coker in Jaffrey. We have a market garden here. Yeah, up in Jaffrey, so East Kootenays.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for introducing yourselves. Did I miss anybody? If so, please just go ahead, unmute and introduce yourself, because sometimes it's hard to see who's on the call. Okay, we're going to get started. And really, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. It makes it so much easier to have a discussion when we actually know who's able to chat. And it also gives Josh a chance to see what kind of farming is being done across the region. For those who missed last week's discussion, we really gave an overview of the Kootenay Soil Building Network, which we're not going to do tonight. I sent out that recording to last week's discussion. So if you want to know more about the Kootenay Soil Building Network, just watch that. Basically, it's a soil support group. There are 6 case studies being written up right now to sort of document further what's involved with soil building in the Kootenays. There's a discussion series. We're starting with a 3-part series, but I really won't be surprised if this goes on, into the spring or maybe just, next year, depending on people's thirst for discussion. And there's also been some advanced soil testing. We haven't received those results back from the Ministry of Environment, but there will be, there's basically this pilot looking at how to enhance soil measurements for farms and how they can, use that as a gauge to measure their soil building progress over time. So why are we discussing nitrogen management? Well, it's often the limiting nitrogen in intensive crop production. And some discussion points that we will be, firing at Josh later on that we're going to get to is like nitrogen availability from different inputs. What's going to meet my crop nutrient demands? nutrient retention and uptake in cold, rainy weather on sandy soils, optimizing plant uptake in colder temperatures. How can we measure nitrogen availability? It is this mobile nutrient, so what kind of testing can actually give me a better accounting of what's in my soil? And feeding the soil or feeding the plants. How do we stay on top of this through the growing season when we're doing a lot of succession and crop production through the year? Farmers in the Kootenays are using a variety of farm inputs. There's the slow release kind like compost and manures and cover crops that release nitrogen at different times of the year and rely on microbial processes. But sometimes that's not enough. And farms are having to also, in addition, apply or exclusively just apply nitrogen in a form that's more readily able to be uptaken by plants, such as a conventional fertilizer or fish fertilizer. Another reason we're talking about this, it's because it's expensive. How you choose to feed your crops is affecting your bottom dollar. And whether it's cover crops, manures, fertilizers, or even ramial wood chips, it's all taking labor and time. So figuring out the most efficient way to meet your crop nitrogen demand is always a hot topic. In this, I use this picture here because Dr. Bill Chapman is in the white t-shirt, and he's the one that really is advocating that using ramial wood chips can be a source of nitrogen. And for us Kootenay folk, that's a local source of nitrogen. We don't have much information on that necessarily, but I like this picture because it contextualizes some of that problem solving that's been going on about what can be used more locally and more affordably. So we're not, using the poop pipeline from the Fraser Valley to bring, our farm inputs from outside of our region. Our Kootenay climate is also a challenge for nitrogen availability when we're relying on those microbial processes to transform organic sources. But we have, freezing cold Junes. This picture here, it's myself and Mike Malmberg in June in the East Kootenay, looking for that crop to come up when, it's like -2 overnight in June. And then our variable soils just create further, I wouldn't say complications, but just uniqueness to every farm. It's, once again, there's no prescription across the Kootenays because we all have different access to inputs, but also this variable soil and often coarse textured soils that, nitrogen just becomes more mobile when it becomes plant available. And to finish off, just once again, a lot of producers on this call are commercial producers looking at multiple successions throughout the season. So how do we build the soil and feed the soil at the same time as making sure our plants are also getting the right crop nutrient demands to run a successful business? That's a whirlwind for some Kootenay context. Jeff's going to whirlwind us through some nitrogen availability from different inputs. So Jeff, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, and so as Rachel mentioned, like a lot of the emphasis we heard from our last session was some discussion about like inputs that we use to build soil. And often there isn't, there's building soil, but people aren't necessarily separating the concept of building that versus providing the core nutrients that you need in order to produce a crop for your business. So this topic of nitrogen availability kind of often comes back to inputs. There's the soil supply of nitrogen that we, as well, I'm sure talk with Josh about too, like how to account for that is one piece of the puzzle. But another really challenging part can be, especially when we're using organic sources of soil building materials, is what amount of the nitrogen contained in there is going to be available for you and when, how to predict that. So these are just some kind of examples of ways that you can try and predict how much might actually be available from an amendment. So ideally, these are coming from pieces of information that you might know, and that's kind of where the tricky part comes in sometimes. So like this graph here is showing as nitrogen concentration increases, the likelihood of the amount of available nitrogen also kind of increases. And so if a bag of some amendment says there is 4% nitrogen versus 10% nitrogen, you might expect different amounts of that overall content to become available for plants, because most of these materials contain like the soil, a good chunk of organic nitrogen that isn't immediately available for plants, and then a small chunk of mineral nitrogen that would be quickly what the plants can uptake right away. So this graph kind of just shows, like, there's a few different kinds of amendments that we heard about people using. Lower nitrogen sources on the left there being some of our trimmings from yard compost. So as you get into richer composts made from manure, higher nitrogen contents, and it also means likely higher availability of that nitrogen that's in there. So it's not just higher concentration, but of that nitrogen that's there, even more of it is likely to be available. One kind of catch though is, like, if you're just using that nitrogen concentration as the predictor, there's things that will sort of throw it out of whack or make it a bit difficult to predict. And so, like, a good example here is our liquid products. There's really high availability from them, even though if you look at the sort of fertilizer analysis of that material, it's going to be on the lower side. So they're kind of that outlier if what you're just using is the nitrogen concentration. So Rachel, if you can advance to the next one. Yeah, so kind of like, and in a way is the purpose of like a lot of our discussions, like, okay, what's the next level deeper that we can try and sort of assess and talk about? It's not always as obvious on if you're just looking at a fertilizer analysis on a material, but if you can get a carbon to nitrogen ratio for your what you're using, it'll give you it adds a really nice level of detail there. And so it's a really good predictor for availability. And so as the carbon to nitrogen gets lower, the amount of availability that you'd expect from materials should increase. And so you can see in this example, like, the liquids kind of have fallen in line here compared to where if you were just using nitrogen concentration, it was a little bit out of whack. And again, like, as we get down to the materials that have less nitrogen in them, and generally nitrogen concentration and carbon to nitrogen in organic materials do follow kind of the same pattern, but there's a little bit of variation. But as we get down to things that are less nitrogen rich, and especially less carbon to nitrogen, or less nitrogen relative to the carbon content, you'll see way less available nitrogen there. And sometimes that might actually get to the point where it's not just an availability problem, but a tie-up problem. So as you get some forms of compost, those can actually be having net sort of carbon or nitrogen sink in your soil. So it's not actually producing nitrogen that your plants might be able to use. So if you think about these sort of like inputs that you might be using at the moment, try and figure out, like, do you have this level of detail that you might be able to assess? And if you thought about, like, sure, it might say there's a certain percentage on the bag of nitrogen that's contained in this material, but have you thought about how much of that is actually going to be available in the sort of shorter time frame when you use it? So, like, a lot of these examples are showing about 12 weeks of it. Like, after 12 weeks, this is about how much is available. There's usually kind of a flush of nitrogen or available nitrogen that is used from some of those materials. And then after that, there's a lingering availability that happens year over year with the sort of more tightly bound stuff.
I thought I'd just go to I can go back to the other slide, Jeff, but this kind of speaks to that window of.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, like, with some of those materials, if you know that there's a quick availability out of those materials, think about when you're using it, right? And we've heard some of our folks that are we're working with through case studies talk about how they're incorporating different materials at different times to try and match this. And so this is like a simplistic example where we've just got one crop here, tomatoes. The demand for that peaks, mid-season, and early on when it's easy to apply amendments is not necessarily when it needs large amounts of nitrogen. It's also at a time where, like early on, the root development of the crop is sort of pretty small. Like, it takes them time to establish a good root network to intercept nitrogen in the soil and pull it up. So using different materials at different times can sort of increase your likelihood of getting nitrogen in that right spot when the plant needs it. So as we're sort of overall thinking about how we might use these things, the actual material itself really is an important thing, and being able to try and understand that is kind of a key thing for predicting what to sort of apply and how much. The other thing would be just generally how you like depending on how you're applying it and where you're applying it, it might affect availability. So like the things that you're able to incorporate, these amendments that where a lot of the nitrogen's in the organic form, it takes organic processes in the soil to mineralize that. And so soil contact is super important there, and a stable kind of environment with nice moisture and temperature. So usually that environment occurs in the soil, not on top of the soil, which has sort of successions of drying out and disturbance. So ideally getting it incorporated, you're going to see better availability. If you're not incorporating it, just be aware that what you might expect is a little less availability and maybe some more loss of nitrogen from that. And then, like Rachel mentioned too, the temperature is a huge thing. If you're applying early in season, just be aware that, you know, amendments that are organic or have most of the nitrogen in organic forms take longer to become available. And that generally the being aware of like when your crop's roots are established, where the roots are likely to be in the profile, and how much nitrogen you want to be like having available at the right time to maximize sort of crop uptake. So I think the only other thing for timing is to consider, you know, some of the materials, there can be outliers for those general rules of availability. A lot of our amendments that we might be using will probably be from plant sources. And depending on how much lignin is contained in some of those things, it can affect like the actual availability because it kind of traps nitrogen in a structure that is less digestible by the soil organisms that'll gradually make it available. So even though something might have a fairly decent nitrogen concentration, if it's sort of bound within lignin structures, it can take a little longer for those breakdowns to occur. So just be kind of like thinking about the sources that you're using and how you might need to adjust or do that sort of next level of math on how much of it you might need to use at a certain time. So it's just kind of like context and also kind of where, in a way, we're hoping discussion wise, like think about those characteristics of what you're using and if you're confident about that. Because a lot of the time, like it takes a lot of and not just understanding of this, but usually trial like a fair amount of years of working with these things to have a sense of what to confidently assess for availability.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great context provider on like understanding the source and how and when that nitrogen can be plant available. And we're going to put it out before we like just pose our initial questions to Josh there. We did want to open it up to the audience right now. If anybody wants to chime in, by all means, unmute yourself. We just want to know what do you use for sources of nitrogen and what are the challenges? So this is your opportunity to like kind of like open floor. If there's like some questions you just want to get out there, by all means, this is your opportunity. So don't be shy if not sure. Anybody want to tell us what source of nitrogen they use or what's their main source? Oh, David, you're
Multi-purpose. The multi-purpose 444.
Okay, great. Multi-purpose 444. Thank you. John, I saw you unmuted.
Sorry? Yeah, me.
Hello? By the way, if you have another request.
Sorry, that's my phone. So I just told you that I use the 444 balance from Frankia for the multi-purpose.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that what you wanted me to?
Yeah, that's great. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
in that 444, do you know what the nitrogen is coming from?
Well, that's on the ingredients, right? I'm kind of assuming it's bone meal, feather meal, blood meal.
Probably.
That'd be the source. Alfalfa meal that's in the mix, and bat guano.
Yeah.
I think that's in the mix.
Probably.
So
I think David, did you want to chime in there too?
Yes. Couple of things. One, I noticed on your chart, which I don't have in front of me, but it sort of looked like livestock, or at least manure, was up there in terms of availability and maybe lasting power. I'm not sure. There's always a debate about whether you can, through your management practices, incorporate manure, but you can't unless you're farming a chunk. And so traditionally, we've tried to feed on areas that have been broken up for reseeding. A comment on that, but my second question would be about something that was written a few years ago by a guy by the name of Zimmer, I think it is, who was a organic farming guru in the States. You see his books around. And he says, if there's only one thing you can do, or you should spread a thin layer of sawdust. And he was talking about rehabilitating farms that have maybe used up a lot of nutrients, but probably have lots of phosphorus hanging around. But I'm not sure why it was, except I think it was to promote fungal development. So you got lateral transfer of nutrients across your field. So we have a source of sawdust, and it's always a question of whether you put it on raw or try to compost it in some way. So if there's somebody who can comment on those two things.
Great. Well, maybe I see Scott's hands up too. I'm going to make a list here because we're going to get to nitrogen availability sort of from different inputs. So I'm adding that to my list because we do want to talk about this ramial wood chip discussion. And so that sort of falls into the carbon category. Scott, can we grab your
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to keep cohesive thoughts with children yelling in the background. So yeah, right now we're like John, we're also using the Frankia 444 primarily. I think we're looking at changing that for this season to maybe a feather meal product, something with a bit higher nitrogen. Yeah, I think the kind of challenges that I had spoken about before is more about like maximizing nitrogen uptake in cold weather. But then the second question that I kind of had that's maybe a little different is that kind of chart that you just showed with the tomatoes. I'd love to see the sourcing on that. I'd love to see that for other crops too. Because like that's just stuff I don't necessarily have information for. And of course, like, you know, trialing and stuff is good, but it's also good to have a bit of a better sense of that in terms of knowing, like, maybe the challenge isn't nitrogen uptake in cold weather for me. Maybe it's actually something else, and I'm thinking it's the nitrogen, depending on when the timing is of the nutrient uptake of nitrogen for various plants. So I don't know if you have like a compendium of stuff, because we do grow a lot of different things.
Yeah, so the charts should have noted as I was talking, the charts from those were sourced from UC Davis from one of their nitrogen management presentations. My impression of that timing one, however, the availability charts were based on some of their research. The timing one looks very conceptual to me, based on how perfect that uptake curve was. But maybe Josh, I don't know if you have a go-to place for crop sort of timing and uptake, but there is some of that kind of information. It's just, it always needs to be adjusted for where it's from to the like your own.
Absolutely, but it just is like, you know, rather than just complete blind guessing, is it sometimes knowing is it's like, oh, maybe I'll start at week 2 and maybe I'll see a difference, and maybe it's week 3 or maybe week 4 or whatever. But like sometimes it's just like it feels like I'm just shooting blind, and it just is really hard to like ensure that I'm providing appropriately for the crops.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a good, I don't see any other hands up, and I have documented the sawdust because I do want to talk about ramial wood chips with Josh. But Josh, maybe like you can kind of jump in here, and this is Scott's farm here, and Josh was on your farm, and I'm like kind of addressing, like segueing, like you trying to figure out, okay, is it just cold, rainy weather? Sandy soils, how do I plan for that nutrient uptake during that cold weather? So Josh, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I mean, really cold and rainy is kind of one of those things that there's not a lot you can do. I mean, especially as an organic grower, because what we've seen across the border in Washington, they also grow a lot of potatoes and they also have very sandy soils. And so what they can do is if they're using conventional fertilizer, they can split their nitrogen applications and in a way that kind of like spoon feeds the crop. And so if they get like a nice spring rain, they're not losing all of the nitrogen, they're losing just some, and they can apply more in the future.
And Josh, sorry, so I'm just wondering, could you, we're organic, but we could use something like a 1600, like an easy grow, like soluble. Is that something that could be sort of adjacent? Like, I mean, it's not quite as high in nitrogen as the urea or anything like that, but you know.
Right. I mean, but 16, I mean, if we can go back to the chart that Jeff showed, like really as that concentration goes up, like in a way it's showing you the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio of a fertilizer like that would be pretty low. So really most of that nitrogen should become available. When I kind of look at who I would think is like, or the institution is like the best at telling us about organic nitrogen availability, I go to Oregon State. And so typically they do things on either a 4-week or a 10-week time scale. And so obviously, the Kootenays, you're a little farther north, a little bit colder, a little bit shorter summers. And so really, I would say kind of like 12 to 14 weeks is maybe analogous to their 10-week plant available nitrogen. And so that's probably if you're going to start putting out organic nitrogen, where you'd start. And I do have another chart, like they have a good tool, but it tells you like, okay, what is their expected 4-week available nitrogen and 10-week available nitrogen for different organic nitrogen fertilizers. And so looking at it
share your
now,
screen if you want.
yeah, thank you.
And maybe
It
while you're
says
pulling up
it's disabled.
that, I see that we have questions from Devin, Ange, and Nigel. So I'm just going to let you focus on that, but then we'll work in their questions as well to this.
Okay, let's see if I can share the screen. All right, can you see that?
Not yet.
No, not yet. See, I do everything on Teams. Now I don't know what I'm doing.
Oh yeah, it's working. It's working. There you go.
All right, so if you can see this, so like they kind of have done some research and have generalized like these different organic fertilizers. The total in percentage, of course, is going to match the analysis of the material. But something like blood meal, they're telling us at 4 weeks, about 60%, and I don't know why my mouse has all of a sudden stopped working. 60% of that is going to become available to the plant, or 60% of that nitrogen. After 10 weeks, about 75%. So you can kind of go through here and see, and generally, the higher concentrations of nitrogen in these organic fertilizers, more of that nitrogen is going to become available, right? Because there's less inert ingredient, there's, higher concentration, less that microbes are going to use it to break down carbon in the soil.
That's a great chart.
Yeah. If you could share that or like link it to us for something, that would be awesome.
Oh yeah, I have a bunch of links that I will share after this.
Yeah. Okay, Devin, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Muted.
Just a comment too, you guys were talking about application of nitrogen at the right time. I don't know if anyone has used the Farm West T-sum calculator. It's something in the last few years that I've been using, where due to some weather stations, they're giving, my basic understanding is that they're adding degree days up. And when you get to a certain degree day, then there's a recommendation to be applying your nutrients and your plants will use it to the better. So if you haven't taken a look, the Farm West T-sum calculator is pretty good.
What's the T-sum calculator?
Yeah, like temperature sum, T-SUM.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thanks, Devin. And you didn't get a chance to introduce yourself because you were just a tad late. Do you want to just say who you are?
Sure. I'm Devin Chersonoff. I'm here in Grand Forks. We're a cow-calf operation growing the majority of our winter feed stuff.
Fantastic. Thanks, Devin. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but.
Yeah, no problem.
Ange, go ahead with your question.
There we go. So we use organic alfalfa pellets, organic soy meal, a bit of cover crops, and I think that's kind of our main stuff, just to answer that first question. But I'm wondering, in the spring, we do this like fermentation process on our alfalfa to try to get it going, like to release its nitrogen faster. But I'm wondering if it's also possible, if we were to say brew an alfalfa tea, compost tea, can you foliar feed nitrogen in the early spring? Like, is that a way around the soil stuff? So just wondering what can be achieved with foliar feeding.
Yeah, generally foliar feeding, I would say, it works best on like micronutrients and correcting those micronutrient deficiencies that really need to be corrected in season. The truth is most plants take up so much nitrogen, like the chances of them taking up enough nitrogen in the spring is pretty low. Whereas in the roots, they do this active transport, like they actively expend energy to take in nitrogen from the soil. Whereas kind of through the leaves, it's more of a, diffusion process. So it's just much slower. And, maybe it'll correct a slight nitrogen deficiency later in the season in, perennial orchard crops or something like that. But a lot of crops, to me, it doesn't make sense. You really need to, I think, target soil applications. However, I'll say like the alfalfa pellets and soybean meal, I believe, like most of those are pretty high in nitrogen, or at least for their carbon to nitrogen ratio. So I'm pretty sure they would probably supply a fair amount of nitrogen to the crop. And I'm gonna share some more Oregon State resources here. Let's see, I'm trying to look at this table here, but really it's telling us like based on the concentration of nitrogen in the organic material, how much available nitrogen do we expect at 4 weeks and at 10 weeks? Of course, we can modify this a little bit for the area. Maybe I can open this up if that helps at all. But really, I would assume something like alfalfa pellets would probably be in like that 3.5 range of percent nitrogen. So, really you're probably looking at somewhere between, I would say, like 20 and 50 pounds of nitrogen, between 20 and 50% of the nitrogen in those materials becoming available. So, if you add a ton, then half of that nitrogen should become available. If you can do the math of, okay, a ton is this percentage nitrogen, which is this much will become available. So just multiplying out like that.
And to understand that graph properly, Josh, they had the 4 week and then the 10 week. So there's more nitrogen available at 10 weeks. Was I reading that correctly?
Yes. Yeah, so really like that nitrogen release will happen very quickly for like kind of a big bulk of the nitrogen, and then over time a little bit more typically becomes available.
Okay. So that's like cumulative over that from
It's
4 to 10
cumulative.
weeks.
Yeah, it's
Gotcha.
not.
But
So
your
yeah,
main boost is at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And should we ask him about the fermenting?
I kind of only really familiar with like, silage and haylage, and I always thought that was more of a palatability thing for animals. I assume if it makes it easier to digest for animals, it would make it break down slightly quicker.
Yeah, well, I feel like there's, it's hard in the soil world to know what gets soil microbes going or not. We know temperature does, but there's a lot of information out there that says that other things get soil microbes going. And when we're in a cold climate, we're really anxious to get those soil microbes buzzing. And so, does like, I guess fermenting could like warm up the soil slightly. Maybe there's more sugars that soil microbes feed on. These are all kind of using outside concepts and applying them to this idea of like getting the soil going in the spring. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, my initial thought would be like probably. I tried looking up before this if anyone had like done any research on it. And I couldn't find anything. Maybe that's just my Google skills, but yeah, really all the whole soil microbes are kind of supported by like the sugars that plant roots are putting out. Like that's what really gets them going. So anytime you kind of add those like saccharides into the soil, like they will happily take that up and use it for fuel and then, take your carbon and convert it into more fuel, basically.
Think when I was thinking about that question conceptually, um just thinking about like the alfalfa plant, there's like pretty nitrogen rich leaf material and then some really, the stalks of that plant are pretty stable. So, yeah, I guess when thinking about like what it takes to mineralize that, if a bunch of that carbon's tied up in forms that are really resistant to breakdown, then yeah, it was kind of maybe like, and so this isn't like this is definitely what's going on, but just as far as like thinking through why would that approach work, maybe adding some of that sort of super volatile sugar to that ferment to get sort of that process a bit boosted might be like why some of that sort of line of thought works or is sort of suggested to help make the nitrogen portion available too. But yeah.
Thanks. Nigel, you've patiently had your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my question is changing as we're talking here, I guess. But the first question, I've used all kinds of things. We use pelleted chicken manure. We use pelleted alfalfa meal, blood meal, feather meal, compost. Used a little bit of liquefied fish fertilizers. My question is going back to thinking the graph that Jeff was showing about crop needs and release times. And I'm thinking especially of greenhouse operations. That's where we're trying to dial things most closely in our operation anyway. And because it's just often impractical to do multiple fertilizations throughout the season, we're trying to do that sort of front loading and trying to do it at an appropriate timing, which is convenient to incorporate it in the soil, but will also be making that nitrogen available at the time when the crop's needing it. So I'm kind of looking at that graph and thinking that's sort of what I'm trying to do in using a mix of different nitrogen sources, which will become available at different points through the growing season as the needs of the plant change. But I find like, okay, that timing is really hard. And I guess part of my question is looking back at that graph about how quickly the nitrogen availability spikes and how quickly it drops off. My question is there any way of expanding the amount of time that the nitrogen is available before it's, being lost to the atmosphere?
Well, I mean, I guess my opinion would be, especially in, I guess an in-ground greenhouse operation is, if you can apply it, basically in the late winter or early spring, like then as that soil, if you can incorporate it into the soil, as that soil warms up, really it should be converted into ammonium. And like you really shouldn't lose a lot of that ammonium to volatilization because it's been incorporated. It's like if you look at liquid manure, like if you inject it, the expectation is that 95% of that ammonium is going to stick around. Even if you apply a solid and you incorporate it within a day, you still should expect to retain most of that ammonium. And so if you incorporate this material, you really shouldn't expect volatilization losses. If you are, you've got it in the soil, if you have it in under a hoop house or a greenhouse or whatever, if you're not applying insane amounts of water, theoretically, like if it's converted to nitrate, it shouldn't leach either. And really the way to know is like, I know this is maybe the worst thing to hear, but like right before you get that period of rapid nitrogen uptake, take a soil sample and see, how much nitrogen is available to my crop right here. So, there is, if you've ever heard of a pre-sidedress nitrate test in corn, a similar test for vegetables is called the mid-season nitrate test. And it's really right before that period of rapid uptake, you take a soil sample and it kind of tells you how much nitrogen is available to this crop. And usually there's kind of a sufficiency level of, I don't know, 30 parts per million or something like that for a lot of crops. And that's kind of a way to check your timing, if that makes sense.
To check how well I did, but at that point, like in order to correct any deficiency at that point is going to be difficult.
Yeah, unless you're willing to use kind of a high concentration like nitrogen fertilizer, whether it's organic or inorganic, because you can still top it up a little bit like that. To me, the real challenge is getting a lab that can get you the results back quick enough, because I don't think any of the labs in BC are particularly known for their speediness. Scott, do you want to hop in here?
Yeah. Kind of just feeding off of two things that Nigel was saying was, and kind of, anyways, I'm just gonna ask the question. You had kind of mentioned leaching out. We do have quite rainy weather and that kind of stuff. Is there any kind of like back of the envelope calculations or anything that you can kind of like figure out on that? Like, say if I'm putting on feather meal, we have a good sense on like what the release is supposed to be within a 4-week period. We get a lot of rain. I guess my kind of question is just like, are we losing 50% of it? Are we like, we know we're really sandy soil. Like, I don't even know how much I'm losing necessarily. And you kind of get back to this like, oh, we could do a mid-season nitrate test or whatever, and I guess there's no like at-home testing or like a hand probe or like $1,000 tool that I could use to do that.
I mean, there are like nitrate test kits that you can get. How
like strips, or are they like? Is it like a legitimate?
Oh, there's a bunch, right? Some of them you do like a soil water slurry, and it wants to use like the reflectance, or it might be a test strip, or a lot of the times they're calibrated on like the electrical conductivity to kind of estimate nitrate. Generally, they're not super duper accurate. And the problem with taking the soil test is like you don't know what portion of that nitrate is going to leach. You don't know what portion of that is from soil organic matter. You don't know what portion of it is from any fertilizer or nitrogen amendments that you've done. When BC started using the post-harvest nitrate test, it had been established in Washington and Oregon, and they kind of established for a sandy soil about 75 millimeters of cumulative rainfall is what is enough to push, I guess, a portion of that nitrate out of that soil rooting depth for your crop.
So you said 75
millimeters, yes. And then for
that's not much.
No, for loams and clays, I think they said 125 millimeters. So one thing you could do is go on Farm West. They also have, or I guess I don't know if it's still Farm West now. It probably still is. They have a evapotranspiration tool, and they'll tell you how much effective precipitation you've had, because tiny amounts like that barely hit the soil surface are not effective, and they're really not going to move anything. But keeping an eye on the cumulative precip, I guess, from a point in time, could tell you the potential for leaching.
Yeah. So if I get a big rain event after I've applied this kind of stuff, like I should be looking to do a reapplication or something like to consider it otherwise.
Potentially. And I mean, I think that's where they've kind of shown where some of these inhibitors are effective. So you're either urease inhibitors or nitrification inhibitors. Typically you mix them in with granular fertilizer.
Yeah, something that's probably not organic approved, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it's not. So really it kind of comes down to, terminating any cover crops, or, maybe 5 weeks ahead of time incorporating your soil amendment that you want to use as a nitrogen source, and then I guess keeping an eye, taking samples, I guess, frequently to see what your concentration is in the soil.
I guess my question to follow up on that, Josh, like if Scott's using like blood meal and feather meal, that's relying on microbial processes to transform it into plant available form, because that process is slow. Like, would he not, like, he's only would be leaching out that plant available form of nitrogen, right? So is there not like that reserve that carries over by nature of it, it's in like an organic form of nitrogen?
I guess to me it kind of depends on like what the both the temperature and precipitation is doing. Cold and rainy, probably not a lot of that nitrogen is getting converted to nitrate. Some of it might make it to ammonium, but really the two things that we think about the most when we think about like what the microbes really need or the conditions they need to convert nitrogen is moisture and temperature. So if it's warm and it's moist, like it will very rapidly convert, you know, organic nitrogen to ammonium and then ammonium to nitrate. Like in some cases, it can go in just a matter of days if it's really nice. If you have a rainy spring, but it's still cold, chances are there's not a lot of that nitrogen getting converted into either ammonium or nitrate.
And not leaching then.
Right. Really, it's if you're getting a lot of rainfall when it's, you have a good soil temperature, like 20, 25 degrees, that really you're the most susceptible for leaching. And so that's kind of like on the lower mainland, when they grow potatoes, that's kind of the most susceptible to early season leaching. It's because it's very sandy, it's already pretty warm. And if they get a rainfall after all of that conversion has happened, then yeah, they're losing nitrogen. But if you have a cooler spring, chances are it's not converting all of that quick. So when you see like these different resources say, oh, 4-week plant available nitrogen, 10-week plant available nitrogen, it's doing that on good conditions, right? It is assuming it is late spring, early summer, probably irrigated, good, decent, perfect conditions. And so cooler springs will kind of slow down that process.
And then I guess like kind of getting back to what Andrew was saying about foliar feeding, and you're kind of saying that it doesn't make sense. It makes sense for micronutrients and that kind of stuff. Would there be any benefit to thinking about doing foliar in early stages of plant development when it's a cold and rainy season, when it's like your nitrogen isn't mineralizing and or it's leaching through the soil? It's like, aside from giving like injections directly into the plant of nitrogen, I'm just not sure how to like make that readily available for them.
Yeah, I don't think, like, honestly, that you can give a plant enough nitrogen foliarly. It just doesn't take it up in huge quantities. Really, you can try and add fertilizer, because even if it is cold, or because if it's cold, the plant's not really growing a whole lot either, right? It also needs heat. And really, it still does take a while for nitrate to leach through the profile. Just generally one rainfall is not enough to do it. Especially like if your soil is not saturated and it doesn't get up to saturation, the unsaturated conductivity of soils is much, much lower than the saturated conductivity. And so really, if you have applied your sources of nitrogen, and it's still cold and rainy, yeah, it's not converting things to nitrate or ammonium. But really the plant at that point probably is not taking up a lot of nitrogen either. So it's kind of hand in hand that, okay, well, as the plant grows and the soil gets more conducive to this microbial action, that's when the crop will actually need it.
Go ahead, Nigel.
Could you talk more about this, the saturation of nitrogen in soil?
Saturation of nitrogen.
Is that what you were saying? Like you can, you've applied the maximum amount you can.
Oh, I was talking about like the water saturation of soil.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess there is a certain point too where like if you apply certain amendments at a big enough rate that at what point is it soil and what point is it like compost? So that's, I mean, I guess entirely possible if you're going to talk about applying things at, 7, 8, 9 tons per acre, that it gets to be where you're almost growing it in a substrate as compared to soil. And that's when you start taking soil samples, you'll see some like really wacky results. If you've applied like kind of a very, very large amount of something like compost.
Okay.
If that answers your question.
Yeah, no. I misunderstood.
But yeah, I think I get where Nigel's coming from. Just like, especially in the greenhouse where you're growing so much biomass, it's like, how much can you top load the system
Yeah.
with nitrogen?
Well, and
it's-
without causing other problems, you
Yeah.
know, like massive insect infestations.
Yeah, and root development, and you need that balance so that and your pest infestations for sure, but a lot of things do like nitrogen. You're right. So have you, Nigel, found that you're in your greenhouses, do you find like a mid-season lull sometimes where you feel like you didn't top load the system with enough nitrogen?
I usually attribute that to not keeping up with pruning more than to the fertilization.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
But yeah, I suppose I do see, I would say I do see that. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, at a certain point, they're just growing so fast that it's hard. Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the, on the other hand, if I was, following my plan to the T and things were properly pruned, maybe they'd be growing even faster. Yeah. I'm looking at that curve and thinking, as the season goes on and the weather's changing, the days are shorter, they're taking up less, they're taking it up more slowly. There's the mineralization that's happening in the soil naturally. Is there a point that there is not enough available to the plants? I don't know. I'm not sure how to tell.
I guess to me, the tried and true method is like, do you see any like physical symptoms on the plant? Like typically nitrogen presents as
Yellowing leaf.
yellowing on the old leaves.
Yeah.
So, and then sometimes confused with sulfur deficiency, which is the opposite, is the yellowing on new leaves. And the reason for that is the plant can relocate nitrogen from within the plant to other parts of the plant, but it can't do that with sulfur.
Maybe the other place my brain was going is, like our discussion is about nitrogen, but which is for like one nutrient. And plants are greedy things. If there is nitrogen present, they will take it up if they can access it, not necessarily to the like benefit of the edible portion of the plant that you're growing all the time, and it also really complicates things when you're trying to like measure, if you are doing any kind of plant analysis, what the right amount of nitrogen would be to have in the biomass. So vegetables are like that, especially fruiting vegetables, are really complicated.
I mean, I would say that we did take part in a workshop a few years ago with like a greenhouse specialist from Vermont. I think Rachel, I'm not sure if you organized that one. Yep. And I did learn through that I was way under fertilizing. I thought I was giving plenty. And the truth was, in a greenhouse, grafted tomato plants that are growing vigorously require like ridiculously more fertilization than I thought. And so I think we fixed that problem. That's why I say now I don't really think I'm seeing that issue of that mid-season lull, because now we put on like a shocking amount of fertilizer for those plants.
Okay. Yeah, that was Dr. Vern group in
Yeah,
here, right? And the amount of potassium, oh my gosh, it was like I think it shocked a lot of us on the call to front load the system because of the biomass demands on the soil and the nutrients.
Yeah.
It's kind of a good segue. I do want to get to ramial wood chips and the sawdust, but we've talked a bit about testing. What's your 2 cents? I mean, very few farmers are going to go out there right before, like, middle of July, grab this test. And as you said, Josh, some of the challenges are the turnaround from the lab so that the farmers get the results back in time. A lot of farmers on this call do the typical NPK, like chemical tests. what do those numbers really mean to a farmer when they get them back regarding the nitrogen?
I mean, the great thing about soil testing is you can do it a bunch because the test is just that moment in time, right? So the amount of nitrate you can convert it to a pounds per acre. Other nutrients, it's more of an index of availability. Basically, we know at what concentration do I not need to add more of this nutrient. I'm trying to think here what else I need to answer for this question. I would say like for applying, if you're going to get something like ramial wood chips, I would definitely try and get some sort of analysis of it to give you an idea of what nutrients are in it and carbon to nitrogen ratio, specifically, because I assume, different sources, different times a year, things like that, is probably going to provide you a different amount of nitrogen. And to me, it depends on carbon to nitrogen ratio and nitrogen content on whether or not it will actually provide nitrogen. Not to hopefully kibosh anyone's business plans here. But really like lower nitrogen concentrations, I kind of would expect that not a lot of nitrogen would be released. But if it starts getting higher, I assume in the 1.5, 2% range, then maybe there is a certain percentage of nitrogen released over, that time period of, 4 to anywhere between 4 and 16 weeks after application.
That's you're just talking about the ramial wood chips.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And just like back to the testing. So whenever that soil test is taken, producers can have confidence in that nitrogen figure as in that exact moment in time that it was taken in a pounds per acre context. Okay.
Yeah.
And then when people take the samples, I know that the nitrogen can be, like if it's not kept cold, the sample, the microbes can transform that soil before it gets to the lab. So drying or refrigerating that sample will kind of conserve that nitrogen figure a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I always am an advocate for just go ahead and drying it out. There are soil samples sitting in a barn somewhere that were dried out 40 years ago that you can analyze today, and they would probably give you pretty much the same numbers. I would say like if you have the paper you use for cooking, I'm trying to think of the name. That's generally what I say, spread your soil sample out really thin, leave it there for 2 days. Generally that gives
Parchment paper.
Parchment paper, thank you. I should know that. I have a case of it from Costco sitting in my pantry. Throw it out on some parchment paper, then like newspaper, you don't have to worry about getting any sort of ink or anything on it. Spread out really thin, leave it indoors, like out of the sun for a couple days, and it'll be probably less than 1% water by mass. Like it is very stable after that. You don't have to worry about any sort of transformations at that point. So it is kind of a way to like fully arrest that conversion of nitrogen in your soil sample.
Thanks, Josh. People can keep asking questions, but I also know you brought us a deck of slides. So we kind of like got out of our system, like our first top of the line questions, but do you want to show us a few of the resources that you brought along to?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's see. You're going to think that I work for a different group of people after I do this. But that's just because I like using all of their resources. So I tend to try and look for other resources from reputable organizations in the Pacific Northwest / Western North America. Oregon State has a ton of great things. One of my favorite things is this organic fertilizer and cover crop calculator. And it kind of walks you through all of the things that need to be considered. It's got a bunch of great figures, so it'll kind of give you a cumulative plant available nitrogen release of different materials. If you really want to get technical with your nitrogen management, it has a companion calculator. And so this is what I was showing earlier. So really the amount of nitrogen we expect to become available from these different fertilizers after, 4 to 10 weeks in Oregon, which is, I don't know, 5 to 13 weeks in BC probably. The important thing that I like is we could get our cover crop analyzed sometime during the year. And if we just tell it, the area that we've sampled, the mass of the sample, and its nitrogen content, 5, it will tell me try matter 10%. We can scroll across and it'll tell me how much nitrogen is becoming available. They do it on an acre basis, and they also do it on a 1,000 square foot basis. And so they've done a whole bunch of research and found they can find a relationship of nitrogen release based pretty much on the dry matter content and the nitrogen content, because in a way they're factoring in, if they're using dry matter content and nitrogen content, roughly what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is. So really a wood source, you'd expect it to be well below 1% nitrogen. Something like a full-grown crimson clover cover crop would have probably around 3.5% nitrogen, which would then provide probably a fair amount of nitrogen. There is another guide called Interpreting Compost Analysis. We didn't really talk a ton about compost analysis today, but really compost, when it gets heated, the bacteria that kind of break down materials, they function at a fairly high pH. So as it's composting, compost gets to a high pH. Nitrogen at a high pH is volatilized really easily. So really a finished compost, we're not expecting to provide us a whole lot of nitrogen. Something like a fresh manure or something like that would probably provide us a bunch of more nitrogen. And so here is another one. I think this is actually from Washington State University. I like it because it kind of gives us some generic NPK content of different manures, but it also tells us like what percentage of the nitrogen in this manure should I expect to become available. However, if you want to do something a little easier, we do have a tool online called the Manure Nutrient Calculator. And so if you're looking to use different manures on your farm, you can tell it, here's kind of a general material that I want to use. Here's how I want to apply it. And here's where I live. It can give you an estimate of nitrogen availability as well. If you say, okay, I like this, but I want to send my manure off to the lab, well, you can do just that. And you can see that it's estimating a certain portion of that organic nitrogen is going to become available. So you don't have to worry about looking up some number. You can go on our manure nutrient calculator, and we have a full calculator as well, just called the nutrient management calculator. It does the same thing. You can enter your soil tests, you can enter manure or compost test results, you can tell it your crop. It will give you a crop requirement, and then you can play with your rates, play with your timings to determine how much of this material do I want to apply as a nutrient source. Let's see if I keep going. This is a very similar thing. Oh, that's actually something I've already showed you. If I keep going. This is another guide from Oregon State that I really like. If I can get to the top without getting anyone sick. This is actually kind of a guide to determining how much nitrogen will become available just from your soil. So a lot of times, if you're going to sample your soil while your crop is growing, the nitrogen it shows you, is an accurate estimate of what the crop can take up. But that is from, the different materials you've applied. It's from the soil, like the organic matter in the soil. It might be residual from last year, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are trying to determine, well, how much am I just getting from my soil? It kind of talks about the different methods of determining that. Probably the easiest is what they call the buried bag method. And so you basically take a soil sample, you get some polyethylene plastic, I guess I'd call it. You put your soil in it and you bury it, and then at different times of the year, if you pull it out, it will, and you have it analyzed, that will give you an estimate of how much nitrogen has mineralized. So you do have to send it off to the lab as soon as you collect your soil, and then after you pull up that bag of soil. It also talks about the laboratory method for potentially mineralizable nitrogen, which some of you may recognize from some of our soil health measurements. That's done in a lab. I think it's typically done in either 7 or 14 days. What they do is they take your soil and they actually fully saturate it. And then they throw it in an incubation oven at about 28 degrees for 14 days. And from that, they will kind of give you an estimate of how much nitrogen will become available from your soil to your crop. So they're trying to mimic, or they're trying to very quickly replicate a season's worth of conditions in the soil in the course of like 2 weeks. So sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. Generally, the field methods are more accurate. The easiest thing to do, if this is something, and to be honest, you might be getting into the weeds a little bit if this is the kind of thing you're looking at, is what they call a zero nitrogen plot method. And so on your farm, you apply nutrients the same as you normally would, except you find one spot that you want to sample and you don't apply any nutrients. You still plant your crop. At the end of the year, you analyze the soil and you analyze the crop. And since you didn't add any amendments, you didn't add any nitrogen sources, that total amount of nitrogen from the crop and from the soil is actually how much mineralized just from your soil. So if you're in a position where you're consistently doing kind of similar things every year, you think your soil organic matter is, relatively stable. And by stable, I mean you're not producing more or you're not consuming more. That percentage is probably staying consistent year to year. This is a good method to see, hey, how much nitrogen am I getting from my soil during the growing season? That is honestly probably the most accurate method, because the soil is going to experience the same conditions as the soil that received nutrients. It's going to have the same crop. So the plant roots, any sort of, preferential flow of water that happens, probably the most accurate way. But again, this is getting a little bit into the weeds. But I have heard of some people doing this. I actually just was at the Pacific Ag Show, and there's a farmer in Ontario testing out these methods on their organic farm. And I say, wow, they must have a really good soil testing lab. Another guide is for mid-season nitrate. And so for vegetable growers in Oregon, they are using a mid-season soil nitrate test to determine if really they're providing their crop with enough nitrogen from all of their different nitrogen sources. And so it really kind of boils down to this table. Really mid-season, right before that crop really starts taking up nitrogen, they want to take a soil sample, and then they can tell, like, if I add additional nitrogen, do I expect my crop to respond to that? So depending on your crop type and your soil nitrate level, it may say, all right, you might want to apply a little bit more. Again, slightly different area, slightly different soils. To be honest, probably fairly accurate, or at least it's in the same ballpark, playing the same sport, hopefully. So to give you,
Josh, the numbers on the left, that's what the soil test would report back, and then on the right is the recommendations that would come back from the lab.
right.
Okay.
So let's say you took this mid-season nitrate test, and by some miracle, they get you the results back really quickly.
Yeah.
And it says 25 parts per million, and you're growing broccoli. Well, if I have 25 parts per million, I just follow over here to broccoli and says, okay, well, it probably needs 70 pounds more per acre of nitrogen.
Yeah, gotcha.
And then if you had a fertilizer, you could probably add it. If you had kind of a low nitrogen concentration organic source, might not become available in time for your crop. And by might
Mhm.
not, I mean it probably won't.
Which is like a good segue to, we can keep looking at your resources, but, and Jeff might have thoughts on this too, just like how to stay on top of that intensive crop nutrient demand through the season. This is a soil building discussion series. Everyone wants to like build their soil, but how can growers any tips for staying on top of that?
I mean, in my opinion, the best thing you can have is records. So if you can, at the end of the year, if you're going to grow a cover crop, take a sample, have it analyzed for nutrient content, have it analyzed, do some math and figure out the biomass. Soil samples, if you can sample frequently and test those, if you can measure your plant yield, really, if you can keep records of things, you can say, okay, well, I think I applied about this much nitrogen last year, and then I took a soil sample, mid-season, and it said I had this much available. From there, you can say, I either need to apply more, I need to find a different material that has more nitrogen, I need to apply it earlier. You can really start troubleshooting some of your practices. And so it is kind of hard to troubleshoot, like, is it timing? Is this just how much nitrogen I'm going to get out of this material? So something to play with, but only things you can really nail down if you keep good records.
Yeah, Jeff, do you have any other feedback on that?
Yeah, no, that's kind of exactly where my brain was going. At the start, it kind of alluded to like there isn't well, there's a reason there's no perfect test for nitrogen. It's really tough to nail down. There'd be very quick agreement across, I think, all these educational institutions about the perfect nitrogen test if it existed. So yeah, it's not something you can immediately suss out, that like multi-year approach. And I think in some of like Josh, some of the nutrient management materials, it's this approach of you plan, like you make out, like ideally figure out what you intend to do and keep some records of that. Then do that, keep records of what you're doing, and then track what the results are and then adjust following like the following season so that you can try and suss out where some of those, if you have some of those inefficiencies or things that obviously didn't work, so that you can tweak. And it is a really gradual process, unfortunately. Yeah, it might mean changing by increments every year that to like gradually get to the point. And then climate will throw a whole wrench in your assessment of it.
Yeah, and I think that, most of the farmers on our discussion this evening, have been in it for, at least 5 years, if not a decade or two. And so they've done that kind of trial and error. And now it's, fine tuning what's the best use. And also like, it's interesting just hearing like not over applying, it's expensive. So yeah, just fine tuning those application rates and also the inputs, like what's the best way to build soil at the same time as meeting my crop nutrient demands. So I'm just building on what you're saying, but yeah, a lot of people have been using that strategy of test, observe, keep records. But then as they like get more sophisticated, trying to, two birds stoned, like build the soil, be profitable, meet my crop nutrient demands. So it is a puzzle, like we said. Wow, still a show ender.
Yeah, right.
I did want to just like ask one last thing, just to beat the ramial wood chip thing apart. Just like woods in general, we get so much wood in the Kootenays. It's just like no manure, all wood. Like any input on like how we can use all this wood to our advantage.
Really, as a nutrient source, wood is not particularly high in nutrients, unfortunately. I wish it was. That would make things a lot easier. Usually when I deal with wood, it's actually as wood ash, which great source of it's a great liming material, and it's kind of a great source of things like calcium and sometimes potassium. But nitrogen, unfortunately, the carbon to nitrogen ratio of wood is quite high, and I assume ramial wood chips. To be honest, it probably just depends on the materials and when the wood was cut and things like that. I would say the best thing to do is just get a test report that tells you carbon to nitrogen ratio and nitrogen content. And I think that'll kind of give you the best indication of whether it's a nutrient source or whether it's going to immobilize nutrients, particularly nitrogen, in the soil.
I mean, we'll probably talk like that topic for next week is probably going to be kind of huge. But one of the things in through some of the discussions we've had with Nigel and Dieter Giesing about just composting, I don't know if challenges is the right word, but is those measures are all about sort of the net expectation and the nature of some of those materials, like what happens in the short term might be wildly different depending on when you check versus what you might expect at the end of, say, a year or multi-year period. So that is kind of maybe one of the things I was wondering about when you brought up, Rachel, that material is like maybe there might be some observable benefit where, like, if you're just throwing down some of this like material that has leaves in it or other like more nitrogen rich stuff, maybe you would see some benefit from that. But the net benefit over time, I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where like if you grind all that stuff up and then have it burned off and analyze the carbon to nitrogen, it's going to be high. So
Okay.
as a long term, or like how will this look in the full result? That's where my brain goes with that stuff. But yeah, Josh, contradiction.
No, I was actually gonna
Okay.
say that Scott has a question here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you were kind of like we've been kind of talking a lot about mapping out a plan, and there's not this perfect nitrate test, and it's good to do soil tests and plant tests and that kind of stuff. Like I know a few people on the call are kind of in similar positions as I am, where we're growing 50 different vegetables because we're idiots. And I guess with that, like, we've got heavy feeders and we've got lower feeders and we've got medium feeders. I'm just trying to figure out like a median kind of thing to kind of like track around my field to try and use as like a bit of a baseline plan, because so kind of what what I'm hoping to start doing this year is it's like I'm going to try and like pick one crop this year. I think it's going to be onions, and I'm just going to try and track onions for a few years, as it's sort of like it's not it's sort of like a medium feeder as I understand it. And I kind of want to track that as much as possible, because part of it is that like we also have a lot of staff, and I'm just trying to like, yes, we can kind of dial in and like everything, but it's like at the end of the day is it's like I don't have time to do that for every single crop. So even if we have like a baseline that it's like, oh, we'll put on this amount of this at a certain time, and that's what we've been doing, and that's really effective. But like I want to do better than that without it becoming this like insane labor thing. So like I guess the regime that I'm trying to get like a little bit of clarity of, or like ideas or documentation or something like that, is it's like, oh, like how many soil tests should I maybe do in a year? Should I do like a plant sap analysis? When do I do that? Do I do multiples of those things? Like I don't know very much, especially on like the plant like end of things of analyzing that. But maybe you could speak to that, or if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, if I really wanted to track something and I'm using an organic nitrogen source, my two big questions would be like, at what rate, and then when do I apply this? Because to me, you want the nitrogen available at just the right time for the onion. And then I honestly would consider taking one of those like mid-season nitrate tests. So really not long after that crop kind of establishes itself, really it should not have taken up a whole lot of nitrogen. So really sampling then will tell you, all right when this crop needs it, here's how much is available. And then I would go back to that mid-season nitrate guide for Oregon, and I would kind of compare it to that. I mean, I know it's not going to be exact, but to be honest, like, yeah, you're probably looking for there to be, I don't know, 25 to 35 parts per million of nitrate in that sample. Because really the soil sample will tell you what is actually available. And so that's what I would do, the time and the rate.
Yeah, is there like a kind of, and I kind of go back to this as a question I was asking earlier, is there like kind of a good compendium of like crop timings for nitrogen uptake? Like, you know, it's not like we're just growing one thing, because we're growing a different thing and everything's kind of got different needs and timings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, BC does have production guides for a lot of different vegetables. A lot of the timing will probably be based on conventional fertilizers. And so really it'll at least tell you kind of the planting date, and really when it tells you apply nitrogen at this date, it kind of really is saying this nitrogen should be available at this time. And so if you look at it ahead of time, you can kind of backtrack a little bit and say, and plan out like, okay, here's when I'll want to incorporate, you know, either this fertilizer or this compost or this manure, in order to try and make that nitrogen available. But yeah, I mean, a production guide from any reputable source, Oregon, Washington, BC, maybe even Idaho. I don't know if they grow onions or not.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Ross. Ange, do you have a question?
Yes, I just, before this call is over, I just wanted to circle back to what you were talking about, ramial wood, and testing it to make sure that it's actually got something in it or it's going to be a benefit, because we got a wood chipper. We're hoping to use it for mushroom production, but also for making wood chip compost, either to like hopefully use as a peat substitute in our potting mix, or but ideally as a compost as well. So when you said to kind of test it, are you testing the wood chips just like as soon as you chip them? Is that what you meant, or do you mean like you compost it and then see and then send them off?
To me, it depends on what you're going to use it for. Like if you're going to just chip it and immediately apply it, then I would test it as chips. If you're going to compost it, I would go ahead and compost it and then just test your finished compost.
Okay. But you think it's not a good source of nitrogen? Like, is it good? Is it high in anything else that might be beneficial?
To be honest, this afternoon was the first time I'd ever heard of
Oh,
ramial
okay.
wood chips. So this is like honestly just an educated guess. I honestly have never seen a nutrient analysis report for this type of material.
Okay.
So would you just send it to like just A&L Labs or wherever and just get like a fertility test done on it and a carbon to nitrogen ratio?
It wouldn't be like a fertility test. It would probably be some sort of plant analysis test. And they may ask what it is. And like a lot of labs should be able to do wood products and things like that. Because really they're just going to dry it out and then grind it up and then usually digest it chemically and then figure out its nutrient content that way. Some plants they can use near infrared reflectance. That's kind of typical for forages and grain or cover crops, things like that. But something like wood chips, I don't think they can do that.
Okay. And I think, there's a lot of different types of woods that people use in the Kootenays for this type of stuff. So I think that's a great just suggestion to get it tested, because whether it's soft or hard or young could have different values. So thank you.
Just like there is totally different nutrient concentrations in cover crops. There's totally different nutrient concentrations in wood.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ange, I'm going to dig up that article that Bill Chapman sent me once, because he's really the one who's, well, and a lot of people do incorporate wood chips on their farm to some degree because it is just such a readily available carbon source. And some of it is very useful on farms, but it was Bill who was saying that like there is some nitrogen, it can contribute to some, not just soil health, but fertility. So I'm going to dig up that article from Bill, but just keep digging because it comes up a lot. And even if producers aren't using it in their established beds, a lot of producers are using it in alleyways and other areas as well. And I did want to follow up just with Scott to say that in regards to the soil support group, Jeff, Sarah, and I do want to kind of use your onion patch to maybe map out, an application time for your compost, and to just try to help. I know onions, you sort of want them to be your indicator crops, so we want to like support you by using, the calculator to know when's the optimum time to apply it, when should that uptake be happening the most, and maybe we do grab a nitrogen sample midsummer or something like that. So
Cool.
We can chat further about how to do that.
Sweet.
I know we're at 7:30 here, 8:30 for the folks in the mountain time. Did anybody have any last questions that they want to, maybe we won't answer them now, but you can put them on the table and we can get back.
I've got one, which would just be kind of around the question of wood chips and that kind of stuff. Would it be true that if you added, say, a nitrogen source to it pre-application, would you potentially reduce some of the risk of the wood chips robbing like nitrogen from the soil? Because I was doing some biochar tests a few years ago now, and I was actually inoculating it with alfalfa meal in hopes that I would kind of like prevent all that kind of robbing, and it seemed to have worked, but I wasn't quite clear if that's actually the right mechanism, and like that's, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it. The recommendation in blueberries, like because they like to apply sawdust, is if they're going to apply sawdust that year, up the amount of nitrogen you apply by 25 pounds per acre. And so yeah, if you're going to apply wood as like some sort of, material to help your soil structure, or soil health, or whatever, if you add extra nitrogen, then it'll help break down that material.
So could you do that in bed too? Like, I'm not saying that I would do this, but just from a like hypothetical thought experiment, is it's like, say if I wanted to use like wood chip as a mulch, like, but then if I upped my nitrogen rate of whatever I'm using, that could hypothetically offset that, and I could benefit from having like the wood chip as mulch? Or is that just as a thought of experiment, not as like anything more than?
So I mean, I guess some of it could pull up some nitrogen, but really, as a mulch, it kind of depends on like how much soil contact it's making there, right? Because really, once the nitrate moves down away from that wood, like the chances of it being taken up to break down that wood is much lower. Really, the sawdust is just super, super fine, and so it kind of in a way almost semi-incorporates itself into the soil, which is why the blueberry growers have to go ahead and apply extra. But yeah, a wood mulch on the surface, I wouldn't think more than like an extra 20 pounds per acre would be necessary if you were worried about that.
So you could hypothetically use wood chips as like a garlic mulch instead of like a straw or something like that.
Yes.
Maybe the thing to consider is like what happens to the mulch
yeah.
afterwards.
You had to ruin my thought experiment, Jeff.
Sorry. Just ruining dreams left, right, and center on our soil building network. Sorry.
Well, this brings us to conclude our nitrogen discussion. We are kind of winging these discussions in terms of we don't really know where it's going to go. So I really thank everybody for their time, curiosity, and questions. It's really fascinating, and the context is in local farms here. So thank you. Devin, this is a photo of Devin's farm. He's on the call tonight. He introduced himself. So this is his cattle grazing the corn stubble up the North Fork near Grand Forks. So thanks, Devin, for that photo. And next week, we are having our compost quality and application discussion with Dieter Giesing. If no one's been in an in-depth conversation with Dieter before, you don't want to miss this one, because compost is his specialty and he's passionate about it. And he will get into, Dieter's really good at talking about, is adding lots of compost good to build your soil? Is this the best way to go about meeting your crop nutrient demands? And he offers insight on that. So I thank you for joining tonight. If you're interested in joining us next week, we look forward to seeing you then. And if there's any more questions that come up, you know all of us, just send us an email, give us a call. This discussion series is also about opening the lines of communications between the ministry staff and the farm advisors, and just making sure that like farmers are connecting to the experts and vice versa. So without further ado, thank you so much. Jeff, did you have anything else to say?
That was an excellent sum up, Rachel. I don't really have anything to add. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. Yeah, and hearing as many questions as we get and is wonderful. So yeah, appreciate it.
Great. And thank you, Josh, for taking your time on Wednesday night.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.